General Orders agenda is number 28, Senate File 444. The chair recognizes Senator Speer.
Madam Chair, I move that when this committee do arise, Senate File 444 be recommended to pass.
Senator Speer.
Madam Chair and members of the Senate, Senate File 444 is a bill that you probably have already heard more about than you want to hear, and I will simply try to, in I hope fairly brief fashion this morning, tell you what is in the bill and what is not in the bill, because many of the letters and phone calls that you have been receiving talk about things that are simply not in the bill and not implied by the bill. Senate File 444 is an amendment to our state human rights law that would add the category of sexual or affectional orientation to the categories that are already protected under that law. It would prohibit discrimination based on sexual orientation in housing, employment, public accommodations, public service, access to education, and access to credit. There would be some exemptions. One would be for what is sometimes referred to as Mrs. Murphy's boarding house, the owner-occupied home where a room is rented out to an individual. That would not be covered. And there is also an exemption for religious organizations, which I'll talk about a little more later because I am going to offer an amendment to clarify that religious exemption. Now, one of the arguments that you've been hearing about this bill is that it affords special privileges for gay men and lesbians. Let me assure you that any careful reading of this bill would, I think, convince you that that simply is not the case. Human rights laws do not give special privileges to anyone. Human rights laws merely recognize that in an imperfect society, some groups have faced discrimination, and some categories have been the basis for unfair discrimination. So we include in our human rights laws those categories around which there have been historic patterns of discrimination: race, religion, gender, nationality. We don't include things like eye color, for example, because we haven't experienced in our society discrimination based on eye color. The question then as to whether or not a group should be included in our human rights laws, whether that group or that category forms the basis of discrimination. And I would argue that historically and still today, there is in our society, there has been and is, a pattern of discrimination based on sexual orientation. Until quite recently, most gay men and lesbians in this culture and in most of Western society have had to hide their identity to protect their jobs, their status in the community, sometimes their very lives. The pattern today is more subtle, but it still persists. Many of you have seen the report of the Governor's Task Force on Gay and Lesbian Minnesotans. I served on that task force for 2 years. It was appointed by Governor Perpich. It was continued by Governor Carlson. It was a group, it still is a group, of about 16 to 18 people who receive no compensation, no per diem. The task force has no staff. Everything is done on a wholly volunteer basis. And this group has gone around the state, has taken testimony from people in order to determine whether patterns of discrimination exist based on sexual orientation. Now, some have argued that the report of this task force is flawed because it does not include statistics. I would simply ask you, where would the statistics come from? There is no agency that is currently empowered to receive complaints of discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation, no agency collecting data. So the task force did only what the only thing it could do. It listened to people. It listened to those who told stories of loss of jobs, of lack of promotion, of inability to find housing. And those who heard that testimony were convinced beyond a shadow of a doubt that discrimination is still a persistent factor in many parts of Minnesota. Now, does this discrimination turn on behavioral patterns? It's another one of the arguments that has been suggested. I would argue that if you look at the testimony of those who came before the task force, you would find very clearly that the discrimination was not based on anything these people did. Employers, landlords had no knowledge of their sexual behavior, and indeed the sexual behavior of gay men and lesbians runs across the gamut, just as does the sexual behavior of heterosexuals, from celibacy to promiscuity, with all the gradations in between. But that wasn't the issue. The issue was not how these people behaved, it was what they were. And the cause of dismissal or lack of promotion had to do with a rumor that was heard, or a slipped word at the water cooler, or a person's associations in their private life. It was not a matter of their behavior, it was a matter of the perception of who and what they were. So this bill does not ask for special privileges for anyone. It only asks that discrimination ends. It only asks that we have a level playing field, that there are equal opportunities in this state for all people, regardless of their sexual orientation. There is nothing in this bill that would require affirmative action for gay or lesbian people. Nothing that could lead to it. There are already many groups within the human rights law that who are not included in affirmative action programs. We do not include Jews or Catholics or Italians or Swedes in affirmative action program, but they're protected from discrimination on the basis of their religion or nationality. No jurisdiction that has ever passed legislation of this kind, in 7 states and countless municipalities have, and no jurisdiction with this kind of human rights protection has it ever led to affirmative action. There is nothing in here about domestic partners' benefits, nothing that could lead to it. There is nothing in here about homosexual marriages. In fact, the law of the state of Minnesota states very clearly that marriage must be between a man and a woman. And there is absolutely nothing in this law that condones or even suggests any condoning of pedophilia or child abuse. I have probably found this the most offensive charge, that this bill has something to do with child abuse, with the sexual abuse of children. Sexual abuse of children is a serious crime in the state of Minnesota. I have authored a considerable number of bills on this subject. It should be a very serious crime. And just to make it absolutely clear, I'm going to offer an amendment in a few minutes to state explicitly that this law does not protect people who have attachments to children. Many of you have received calls in opposition to this bill. I'm aware that there is a highly motivated group of people in this state who fear what this bill would do. But I would also point out to you that the polls consistently show that most Americans oppose discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation. They may not approve of the gay lifestyle, but they think that discrimination is wrong. And this bill, regardless of what the opponents say, is simply about discrimination. It is not an endorsement of any lifestyle. I think if you look at the list of groups, you have that, I think, on your desk, that have indicated their support for this bill, you would understand the distinction that many groups have made. You will note, for example, that this bill is endorsed by a large number of religious organizations. Some of those religious organizations disapprove of homosexuality as a lifestyle. Nevertheless, they make the distinction. They oppose discrimination and they support this bill. I would particularly ask you to read the carefully worded statement from Monsignor Habinger, representing the Minnesota Catholic Council, the Roman Catholic bishops of the state of Minnesota. A church that, as you know, does not support homosexuality. Monsignor Habinger indicates in this statement why the Minnesota Catholic Council supports this bill. You will also note that there is support from a wide range of civic, business, and labor groups, of prominent people in our state, of both parties. Our Republican governor supports it. Our Democratic Attorney General supports it. 7 states have similar legislation. Our neighboring state of Wisconsin has had over 10 years of experience with legislation of this kind and has experienced no problems. The cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul have passed ordinances that are almost identical to what's in this bill. Minneapolis has had this ordinance for almost 20 years without problems. So the support is broad and the track record ample. Finally, I'd like to say something on the personal side about this bill, and this is not something that comes easily for me. I think those of you who have known me for a while know that I don't talk a lot about my personal life. But I refuse to let other people question the validity of my own life experiences. I have been told by many people who oppose this bill that sexual orientation should not be included in the human rights law because it is a choice. Because it is a choice that people make, and if they make a choice, they can change that choice. Well, let me tell you that I am a 55-year-old gay man, and I am not just going through a phase. I can also assure you that my sexual orientation is not something I chose, like choosing to wear a blue shirt and a red tie today. Why in the world would I have chosen it? I grew up in the 1950s. Everyone I knew was presumably straight, all of my models. Homosexuality was something that people only whispered about. My first awareness of what I was filled me with absolute panic. I did everything I could to change. I dated girls. I denied my inner feelings. I sought psychiatric care. I didn't make a choice about that. I could do nothing about what I was. I did make a choice. My choice had to do with how I would deal with who I was. I chose, after many years of hiding who I was, to be open, to be who I am, and to live my life without shame or apology. And that's a choice I've never regretted. But I was fortunate. When I came out, I was already a tenured college professor. I lived in a tolerant urban community, and I had supportive friends and families. Not all gay and lesbian people are that fortunate. Many today continue to live in fear, in hostile communities, with jobs they could easily lose if their sexual orientation was discovered. They're forced to live lives based on lies and deceptions. Much has been made in the debate that's been waged over this bill about how sexual orientation is determined. I won't pretend to give you any kind of a definitive statement on that. Scientists who study the issue still are debating the nature versus nurture argument. But there is much scientific evidence that sexual orientation is, at least in part, genetically determined. And all experts agree that it is determined either at birth or very early in life. It's not something that is chosen. We are what we are. And we are asking only that we have the same rights that others take for granted, nothing special. Just the right to a job commensurate with our ability, the right to decent housing, the right to a good education. And that's all this bill does. I've been working on this bill for 20 years. The first time it came before the Minnesota Senate was exactly 20 years ago when late Senator Nick Coleman asked the Minnesota Senate to pass it. And I think the Senate has considered this bill about 8 times over the last 20 years. So it's not exactly a new issue. It's going to be resolved, and I think the time to resolve it is now. It's time, Minnesota.